Welcome everybody once again. It's a pleasure to have you here in this first webinar of the year. Well, Stanley, we are here with the first webinar of the year. How are you feeling in this new year, 2024? Complicated? Because we are in the tax declaration season at the same time, and now we have this and FINCEN, which we will be talking about a little bit later during this webinar. So that's making our life a little bit complicated. That's true, but we have an interesting year ahead of us. And well, during this webinar, we will be speaking a little bit about which have been the developments of the previous year and what we will see that will come into 2024 as well. Among those things, there are some regulatory changes, and we're seeing greater cooperation between the world regulators from different countries as from within the US. The regulators of different departments, and they're sharing information and really discussing amongst themselves and coordinating not only regulations but also the application of the law. In the EU, the Anti-Money Laundering Authority is really harmonizing the rules, the local rules. They're working together with all of the WAFs of around the world, including FINCEN and the central banks, to apply this law. And an interesting thing that is something maybe new is that they're focusing very much on self-regulation. Some banks and bank groups have already taken steps towards forming alliances and working on this compliance. And this has very much to do with FINRAs and self-regulation as for insurance, and maybe banks will have a greater self-regulation and regulating groups that will help regulators implement the rules and the regulations. Well, in the past, there was a lack of information or a lack of understanding in several languages and different cultures. So when they're self-regulating in different geographic areas, the people who are more comfortable with these regulations can help the others to translate and understand the regulations. What is happening to regulate digital assets in the US is pretty interesting. In December 2022, FINCEN announced that the key priority area was digital asset regulation. And they welcomed with great satisfaction the comments of the bank industry about the vulnerabilities and the risks that digital assets pose to its institutions. So our government works in this manner. The government proposes regulations, they distribute these regulations for comments, and they wait for the comments to try and regulate the situation. And to make it easier for the parties involved, FINCEN is also examining the potential to have decentralized finances to reduce or eliminate the role of financial intermediaries that play a critical role in combating money laundering and financial terrorism, and will determine whether additional regulations are necessary. FINCEN and other regulators have decided that there is a great amount of activity in the terrorism area with digital assets, and they're trying to be on top of that. I attended an event in Mexico against corruption, talking to people from the IRS, the criminal investigators, and they told me very gladly that they're very comfortable with the process of researching and analyzing what is happening with digital assets. And the truth is that it's very easy to audit, because it cannot be erased. Nothing can be erased. So the concept of anonymity is very rare. Nothing is anonymous. And they have the math now to investigate and research what's going on a ledger, which is made of digital assets systems, and using artificial intelligence for that follow-up. Yes, with the artificial intelligence, it can be done faster because you're using very agile computers and very powerful computers to do that. And at the same time, GAFI will require the crypto and digital assets management companies to apply customer due diligence, to do transaction monitoring, and the due diligence, as well as other requirements to fight against money laundering. And together with the targeted technological solutions, the new regulatory arrangements are anticipated to make it harder for criminals to misuse digital assets for money laundering purposes, meaning that they are creating barriers against the use of digital assets. And the truth is that when they were speaking about cryptocurrency, they were naming the asset wrongly, because a currency cannot be currency without it being legal in the region where it is being used. And that has caused several issues in different countries when they have tried to make an effort for their population to accept these cryptocurrencies as a normal currency. And the truth is that you cannot buy or use this cryptocurrency. They need to be exchanged as assets, as capital assets. And that is the way in which the United States is treating that as a capital asset. You know, this is something that we hadn't spoken about before, but I think that, for instance, now there is a case again in front of the Supreme Court that could have an impact on that regulatory system, because there's a case where they are questioning whether the regulatory agencies have the legal authority to implement all of these regulations if the laws are not that specific. And I can imagine that there's no specific law regarding many of these issues. That's something that's being worked on. And I think that this is going to be a situation, well, maybe we are entering a little bit of uncharted waters. Yes, because this system in the US works in a specific manner. The Congress is having some laws now. The laws are not well detailed. And in the past, in the history, they're giving the authority to several agencies and regulators to make specific rules. In the case of our IRS, it decided that these digital assets are capital assets. Although in other places it could be named and dealt with as currencies, these digital assets were treated as currency. So if they made the decision to make a rule, could you protest against that? And could you go to the Supreme Court? I have my doubts about whether the Supreme Court will restrict what is being applied to the court, what has been done, because they are also trying not to pass a national law of U.S. management taxes in the U.S. So I have my doubts. So it's interesting. Yes, it's interesting, and it is also part of the times we're living in, of the story. Yes, but I think they're also considering laws regarding artificial intelligence. Yes, because there are many frauds and abuses that are taking place. And they're using these laws to create, for instance, deep fakes. So fake information. They are trying to put people in bad situations. They're impersonating people to steal their money using artificial intelligence to do this. So the artificial intelligence has two uses which are very important. It is very good for banks and organizations to detect any suspicious activity and to prevent money laundering. Therefore, the use of AI is expected to increase extensively in 2023 within the framework of AML compliance, meaning that they are trying to make banks enthusiastic as well as other related organizations for AML reasons or to maintain their sanctions or for anti-corruption sanctions, because nobody has a brain that can function as fast as a computer, and the algorithms that are being used are really very well formed to do that. And when they are working, they are at the same time learning. What is artificial intelligence? It's an algorithm that can learn or that can learn by itself with certain restrictions. The artificial intelligence can help the companies remain compliant with AML regulations in two ways. First, by simply monitoring the transactions and detecting suspicious behaviors. That is simple, right? But in second place, AI can educate compliance officers on how to use AI itself so that the financial institutions can make sure that they remain compliant all the time. So while they're working, AI is learning. So it's there to give information that can also educate the management, the leaders, and the people who are working at the banks how to avoid issues with AML, issues with OFAC and sanctions, issues regarding corruption. Another area where we saw in 2022 and 2023, where we saw several changes, it has to do with correspondent banking, especially with international trade, and we're focused more on this. We will have a course about export controls that will be available in a week or two, and we're going to announce that to all of our participants in the webinar once it's ready. And this has been updated at the crime principles for correspondent bank, which was updated in 2022. It applies for non-bank financial institutions, the fintechs, and what they want from Wellspring is the need to know all of the correspondent banks, understand whether they have periodical reviews, and that their correspondent banking are accepting and that they have the due diligence programs that are required to make sure that they are fulfilling their obligations, because the export controls are going to be a focus during this year, and I imagine the next as well. That is something that I hadn't heard yet, but Wolfsburg, as well as other private organizations which act as advisors to the world in this area, do not have their own power to directly implement what is being proposed or what they're assessing about. It's the governments which need to adopt and direct what they want to do by using Wolfsburg's help. GATHI, which is a EU arm as well, it's not like the regulators in the US, the regulators in the UK, or regulators in any country. Those regulators which need to adopt the recommendations and implement them in the local laws. So it's like a sword. It is strong on both sides. It is sharp on the one side, and a very, very sharp side is the power of the governments to do what they're being assessed about. Another change is the update of the high-risk jurisdictions. Yes, and there, do you have, yes, perfect. So you can see that these are high-risk jurisdictions. We have Barbados, Bulgaria, Haiti. It has been there for a long time, and unfortunately there are disastrous things from the social point of view in Haiti. But we can see others here as well. So they're not on the same island. The Cayman Islands were removed in part due to the increase of the application of the law and the sanctions for money laundering, and Panama for updating the information about the final beneficiaries and increasing the monitoring of offshore entities. And GATHI still publishing these lists. They have the Cayman Islands, which is not there, Albania, Jordan, which is no longer in the list. But what is happening is, as I was telling you, is not that GAFI can implement something in the countries. It's the countries which need to adopt or sharpen their sword so that they can escape that list. Precisely. And that is very, very interesting to me. I never used to say that it was a sword sharpened on both sides, but it seems to be so. Well, interestingly, what helped Panama was the update of the information about beneficiary owners, which is precisely one of the newest and maybe least spoken changes. Well, people outside from the US might be aware that in the US, as from the 1st of January this year, all of the entities which are not exempt, meaning most of the entities, do need to register with FINCEN their beneficiary owners of their entities. And this applies to any entity that might have been formed with a document presented as a state, with a Secretary of State of a state here in the US. It excludes, for instance, entities that are publicly or publicly regulated, or that have a stock exchange listing. It's very wide, and it is causing an earthquake between lawyers, because anyone who creates a company and who is part in the process of registering the company as well needs to be exposed in that report. So for lawyers, they have many here have the rights in this area, in Florida and in other parts of the United States. We're speaking about a million, 1,200,000 lawyers, more or less. They do not want to participate. They are not doing the reports because they think that what's the name? It's an invasion of their it's the protection of data protection client, the customer protection. No. Well, it's an invasion of the confidentiality client. Oh, privilege, client privilege. Yes, because it's a privilege to be with the client, and then the lawyer has it's forbidden to share information regarding the client. So they're in a position where they need to share about the presence of the lawyer. They need to disclose the presence of the lawyer about the creation of the company, and not only the lawyer but also the secretary who is doing the reports to the state. So to the state, or who's helping in the registration of the company in the US. And that involves 33 million legal entities right now. 33 million, which need to be registered by the end of 2024. That is many, and it's not a difficult process. But at Foodman, we published an article. You have the link at the chat. It's available in English and Spanish about how to do the CTA, which are the requirements that you can use it. And if you have many clients for whom this applies, and it applies to entities done in the US and foreign entities that are registered to do business in the United States. So it is very important to understand which are the requisites of that. And if the person who's registered with FINCEN, this report of beneficiary owners, the person who's creating the report and who's presenting it to FINCEN, if it is a company that is not represented in their profession, the due diligence is extensive. And it's not a minor cost. So for many, it's a little bit more than they wish to pay. You need to pay that only once. Once they've been registered, they are registered. The only thing that they would not go back into FINCEN to do it again unless there are changes in the owners or shareholders of the company. And companies made offshore and registered here in 2024 or later, they have 90 days to register the company, and they have all of the year 2024. But if they have been formed this year, they have 20 days to do their first registration with FINCEN, and after this year they will have 30 days to do so. It is very rigorous as a requirement. And that brings us to the next area that we were going to touch, which is the law enforcement. our Justice Department, the Justice Department, and it's very serious. Oh, I'm sorry. It's something very serious. Yes, it's it's aggressively prosecuting firms for regulatory violations. And the criminal charges are always bigger for AML compliance programs. The failings, the fraud in the digital assets market leads to money laundering charges. And the OFAC's focus on sanctions violations and money laundering in the digital assets ecosystem, these are increasing. These amounts are growing. There are also many cases that we could present today. For instance, Binance. Binance was and is still one of the biggest companies in the world for cryptocurrency or for crypto assets. And due to failures in their anti-money laundering and failures in the OFAC and so on, their ex-CEO, their ex-president, had a fine of $150 million, and the compliance officer, $1.5 million in fines. And there were many, many failures in due diligence, and they were not considered who they were doing their businesses with. Our government here is very serious, and it's trying to maintain its transparency and the cleanliness of our money flow here. And I think that Binance is an example of how the DOJ is the tip of the sword and all of the agencies are behind. Because Binance had fines from OFAC, FinTech, and it will still get a fine from the SEC. Yes, and it's very interesting. And why? Well, governments are interesting. I cannot say anything about other countries, but in these countries, the regulatory departments are arguing, are fighting to get a part of the fines. Because these are like taxes without having a new tax law. And they use that money to increase their own power in their departments. So the CFTC, SEC, they're all trying to get a part of those fines from the violations to increase their pockets. Binance is something very special. We're also speaking about other companies like Blue Dollar Peso, which was a cryptocurrency that, well, it was actually a pyramid scam. And I don't remember. Maybe you have it right in front of you, how much the fine was, but it was very big as well. Each time there's a research and a fine, they are increasing. They start slow and they become stronger and harder. That's the way it works for our regulators. And I think that also in Europe, and the units in other countries which control this as well. They are learning. I see bigger and bigger fines in other countries. And this is led by OFAC. OFAC in 2023 had a total of $1.5 billion in fines. And growing, and that number's growing. Yes, and in 2024 it's going to be bigger. And you can see in the previous years, 20 millions, 40 millions, but 1.5 billions, just to show how big it is. Wells Fargo, 30 million, because they were providing software to a European bank that was doing trade finance with sanctioned jurisdictions. The 3M company, which was selling plates, sheeting via a German reseller, and then this was exported to Iran. And they were allowing sanctioned jurisdictions, Poloniacs, allowing customers located in sanctioned jurisdictions, NASDAQ, OMX. It was fined because it was allowing to have. I want to say something. NASDAQ acts almost as a government agency because NASDAQ has its own rules to participate. I am amazed by the lack of fine here. It is not much, but all of these are examples of fines of just being soft. This is, of course, increasing now its hardness. Microsoft. But those are companies that are North American companies which are very powerful here. So when they're being hit, except for Wells Fargo, because that one has an additional story, but these are actually soft fines compared to others that are taking place right now. But as you're saying, this will increase. And all of these are the last Binance. There were several agencies that were participating in the fines. But we are seeing many with digital assets, many with export controls that are being violated, sanctions that are exporting to North Korea, Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, so on and so forth. Yes. We're honestly seeing less with Cuba and Venezuela because they're somehow trying to soften that. They're speaking about softening those sanctions. The focus right now is export control against Iran, Russia, and North Korea, which are presenting a danger to the world given their war activities in Europe and the rest of the world. Well, there's another case, Banca de Crédito Internacional. Previously, if they didn't have a regulator in the country, they were not forced to have exactly a program of AML as they wish, as the government would wish. But now that doesn't exist anymore. Now all of the banks need to have an AML program of OFAC compliance because they're not making the fines softer, but they're making it actually harder. We have others like Shinhan Bank. They complained about the fact that the AML program was not reasonably designed. So there's a mixture of everything. And how do they do that? Because they do investigations that show that the program was not designed in a reasonable manner, in compliance with what the government wants. And that's only in the United States.